This is another iRaw podcast.
Here in the United States, we also fund our animal shelters in the same way we do our school systems, for example, which is entirely out of local taxes. So a neighborhood that is lower income is also going to be producing a lower tax base. So their shelter is going to be lower resourced, which means that in general, the rate of killing overall in that shelter is going to be higher than, for example, another shelter that might just be 10 or 15 kilometers down the road, but is serving a more affluent, and in the United States, that generally also means a whiter population of people whose homes are producing higher property taxes and therefore more money for the shelter system, so it can be more innovative in implementing life-saving programs.
Welcome back to The Animal Turn, everyone. In this bonus episode, we're going to be talking about the easy breezy light topic of death. Death and dying haunt the edges of a great deal of what we talk about on this show, so it was nice to have the opportunity to think about death more deeply. Katja, Guenther and Julian Paul Keenan join me today on the show to talk about their edited volume, When Animals Die, Examining Justifications and Envisioning Justice. The book is structured in 3 parts, all with death in mind: before, during, and after death. And it has 10 chapters from disciplines that are as wide-ranging as forensics to sociology. We touch on some of these chapters in the discussion, but mostly we talk about what death is, the difficulty with defining death, as well as why it is significant to focus on death and what Katja and Julian are calling the emergence of death studies. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Katja is a professor of gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Riverside, where her research and teaching focus on gender, feminist activism, and social movements. Her work centers on improving our understanding of how and why inequalities of gender, race, class, disability, and species reproduce so reliably, and what we can do to challenge these inequalities. In addition to editing this volume with Julian, Katja has also authored The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals. Katja has spent a great deal of time thinking about death and the ways in which our society is structured to make the lives of animals and their deaths possible. Julian, on the other hand, is a professor of biology and psychology at Montclair State University in New Jersey, USA. His focus on animals is centered around consciousness and cognition, attempting to understand how vastly different nervous systems have evolved. Julian is the founder of the journal Social Neuroscience, and he is the first to identify the neural substrates of self-awareness. He approaches death and thinking about death from a much more biological standpoint than Katja and I, and it was a really interesting conversation because Katja and I tended towards thinking about the social ways in which death is thought about and structured in society, and Julian would kind of bring in the biology and thinking about how the brain works. And it was just a really, really nice conversation. And I think it really shows purchase to how this idea of death studies or animal death studies really can grow substantially. Anyway, it was a really, really interesting conversation. Just a reminder, if you have the time, to please check out our merch store and to leave a review, that would be wonderful. Money from the merch goes towards helping me to get help to make more content, and the reviews help other people to find the show. Also, as always, a thank you to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, Law, and Ethics for their long-term support. They give me a little bit of money for each episode, and that kind of helps to pay for, hosting providers and websites and all of that, which really, without their help, the show wouldn't be possible. So thank you so much to Apple for your long-term support of the show. And as always, thank you, listeners, for taking the time to listen and share your views. Every time I get an email from a listener telling me that this show matters, it makes a difference. So thank you. I always love hearing from you. Okay, enough ramble from me. Let's get to it. Hello, Julian and Katja. Welcome to the Animal Turn podcast. It's great to have you on the show. I very, very, very much enjoyed reading your book, When Animals Die. And I'm looking forward to talking to you today about, the light topic of death. Everyone's favorite topic. It's easy breezy topic, but I think an important one. So thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It's great to have you. And normally I ask people right at the beginning of the shows to tell me how they became interested in animals. But maybe I'm going to do something a little bit different with you guys and ask, have you ever thought about your death?
I think that was actually what brought me to the animals, and then back to the humans was that sort of question. Was thinking about, um, I mean, you were mentioning, it's not a happy topic. It's a taboo topic. It's a under investigated topic. It's a topic that really, at the end of the day, we don't understand. And so one of the things was like, we always talk in biology and in neuroscience, do animals comprehend their own death? Like, do they know about mortality? And then that obviously brings you to, well, before we ask that question, do humans know about their own mortality, or is it just make believe? Um, and I always go back to, there was a pretty famous show here in America called The Sopranos, and at the very end of The Sopranos, millions of people watching, all of a sudden the screen goes blank, and it's black for 60 seconds, and everyone thought their cable went out. This is back in the day of cables and TVs. But really what the directors were doing was like, that's what death is it's just going black. And so even that I can't comprehend. So I think that before I get to, do animals understand their death and animal death, and do I understand? The question becomes: can I understand my death? Are human brains actually capable of that? I mean, if the answer is yes, then maybe we can go on to animal brains, and then if the answer is no, maybe animal brains have something we don't have, that they can comprehend it and we can't, which is a very unpopular position in biology and neuroscience, that the animals might be able to outdo us on something cognitive. But that was sort of, I think it's a great question because it really relates to, what inspired at least parts of this book.
Yeah, and I know you wrote about this in the book as well. You kind of spoke about the extent to which animals and humans comprehend or understand their death. And you spoke there a lot about the brain and biology. So maybe just for the listeners' sake, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? Because this was really an interdisciplinary project here. What kind of research and scholarship do you do? And how did you come to think about animals in it?
Yeah. I mean, the great thing about Katja and I is we're complete opposites. Everything, I mean, we're on opposite ends of the country, opposite ends of the academic spectrum. It's really, really wonderful. My end is neuroscience. And I always start every lecture by saying neuroscience is a science of failure. That given all that we know, we really know nothing compared to what we should know or could know. And one of the big failures is we have no idea about death, right? We just really don't have a real good view of death. So I'm interested in self-awareness. So way back when I was a kid, back in post-grad and grad days, I was studying self-awareness and how well do people know themselves, and how is the brain capable of that, and obviously how well do animals know themselves. And we started with simple tests like, do chimpanzees recognize themselves in a mirror? And that led to some of the bigger questions, are they conscious? So I came at animal death in that way, from a really hard science, neuroscience perspective.
And how about you, Katja? So have you thought about death, and how did you come to think about this kind of connection between animals and death?
Yeah, I don't know that I want to say that I think about death a lot, because I realize I don't really know how much or how little other people think about death. But I do think that most people at some point in their lives imagine what their immediate life world would look like without them in it. Who might mourn for them if they died. They might be facing some experience where there's an increased risk of death, maybe been diagnosed with an illness, or you have to have a major surgery, right? And I think that naturally is attached to some moments of reflecting on on what dying could potentially be like, and also what the world after you potentially could be like. So I would I would confess to having those types of thoughts at various moments. And I think somewhat like Julian, it's a personal strain of thinking that then also connects into this broader research interest or question. I am trained as a sociologist, and I'm a faculty member in an interdisciplinary department of gender and sexuality studies that includes both faculty from traditional humanities disciplines and from traditional social science disciplines. And within those fields, there's sort of a question about the valuation of death, whose life matters, right? Whose life is considered important. That in recent American politics has been very much with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That has really been a claim to say we deserve to live, right? Black people deserve to live in this country, and not simply to be killed by police. And so I think that those kinds of questions around whose lives matter have always been at the forefront for my thinking about animals. Why do we not mourn the lamb on our Easter dinner table when we mourn certain other types of animals, right? Our companion animals, for example, when they die. And I think that was actually one of the initial questions that Julian and I had even talked about in regards to the book. Was some of these disparities between different types of animals and the type of mourning that they receive. So for me, I think approaching the book project, and especially having come off of right before that, working on a project about animal shelters here in the United States, and especially those that engage in a lot of killing of animals, thinking about which animals count and how even cats and dogs, if they're put into a certain institutional setting, their lives no longer matter, right? Their lives only matter as long as they're connected to people's lives.
Yeah, your chapter on community cats in the book is probably the chapter that stayed with me the most. It's a practice. I know you wrote about abortive. What is the phrase you used? Abortive spays, which is something I didn't even know existed. I mean, I knew that sometimes cows and pigs, etc., when they were slaughtered, they'd be slaughtered while pregnant, and you would see those kinds of fetuses post-death, but I didn't know that these kind of active abortions of animals were happening with particularly like late stage, like kittens, practically kittens. Birth was imminent, life was imminent, and the kind of decision on the politics of deciding to just stop life from ever happening, that really stuck with me, that chapter. And I imagine it must have been quite a hard project to do, because you're speaking with people who really care about these animals quite deeply and put a lot of time and effort into trying to protect them, right?
Indeed. Yeah. Community cat caretakers or people who are involved in caring for so-called feral cats or community cats invest a huge amount of their personal time and energy. And at least here in the Los Angeles area, I also discovered that the overwhelming majority of people who are doing that work are lower income women of color who are often, quite financially unstable themselves. So the degree of sacrifice that they're making, financially speaking, but also in terms of their time, it's very time consuming, is really significant. And they really value the lives of these particular animals and believe that these animals have a right to thrive, right? Both to survive, but also to thrive in urban communities, that they are an outcome of human intervention in their lives, and that we therefore have a responsibility to these cats to provide them with longer term care. But they also, as I talk about in the chapter, are overwhelmingly supportive of abortive spaying because they know that these cats currently do not have those conditions present. They want the cats to have quality lives, and that's not generally currently possible. here in Los Angeles. And so there is, the position that the kittens are better off having been terminated in pregnancy than coming into the world just to suffer.
I grapple with that myself. I think in general, I'm of the position, you shouldn't kill, but if you're generous to what their views are here, that they're trying to prevent suffering, and I think many people, what's clear here is that reproduction is definitely a key part of death. When we're speaking about death, we're also speaking about reproduction and reproductive rights and who has the choice to birth or have sex even, right? Like my dog Linus is from a shelter and he was spayed. There was no choice for me or for him in terms of reproductive autonomy. But of course, reproduction and death just have a very tight connection no matter the space and the sphere you're looking. Yeah, Julian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, the genetic connection is, for biologists quite obvious, and you can always say as long as you have like a fifth cousin, that you've technically never died, because your genes get transferred on from generation to generation. So, if you are an asexual organism, right, and you go through mitosis, death is a sort of odd thing. Have you died after mitosis? So it's not really a black and white thing in biology, death and that. In terms of those conversations, we're interested in trying to assess how effective it is. Like, are these actually effective methods in, curbing population, making animals happier, et cetera? Try to figure those things out. And the last thing I'll say is if you read Katja's book on animal shelters, it's gripping, informative. And for me, it was like the first time I realized how disparity and racism trickled down to cats and dogs. So like it was the first time I had a slap in the face saying, yeah, this is not just a human problem in America, and I won't speak on other countries, but this is an animal problem, and I was sort of embarrassed that I never contemplated that, but I thought it was it was my takeaway from her book.
Do you want to walk us through that premise a little bit, Katja, and what you wrote in? It was animal shelters, right?
Yeah, the book that I worked on just previously to this project with Julian is called The Lives and Deaths of Shelter Animals. And it's a book in which I present an ethnographic analysis of a high-kill animal shelter here in the Los Angeles area where I live, and really try to unpack how human ideas about race and ethnicity and gender and disability combine to determine which animals are most likely to survive in a kill shelter environment. And it was, I'll say it's central to the book to demonstrate that shelter animal workers and the institution as a whole, the culture of the institution, has embedded within it the same norms and values as the United States as a whole, right? It's not somehow separated from the rest of human society, and therefore holds on to certain assumptions about what kinds of people are the guardians to what kinds of animals. And that in turn increases or decreases the value of the animals. So P.P.L.E, for example, have been a very contentious category of animals here in the United States, as in many other countries. And in the Los Angeles area, they are very much associated, particularly with Latino men from lower income strata who are believed to be, in many cases, breeding them and raising them for traits favorable to fighting them. And all of that, rests on a longer term history of anti-Blackness and the association specifically between P.P.L.Es and Black men, and these kind of beliefs about masculinity and the masculinity specifically of straight men of color becomes attached to or embodied in the pit bulls themselves, and ultimately increases the chances that they're going to be killed in the shelter. They're constantly subjected to special rules and regulations meant to police and control their purported aggressiveness. They have to go through an entirely separate adoption process than almost all other types of dogs. And those barriers to adoption obviously increase the likelihood that they're not going to be adopted. But they're also placed under such a level of scrutiny that unless they're so-called perfect dogs, they're almost certainly going to be killed.
Yeah, it's really challenging and quite political. I think it was Hubbard and Brooks who wrote a paper about animals and gentrification in cities. And they showed how if you look at just the different class dynamics of different neighborhoods, you'll get different breed densities. So almost by looking at the breed, you can kind of tell the class of the neighborhood. More teacup, fashionable type dogs have different concentrations in different areas. And I mean, this happens across nation states as well. And there's something about how our identity is impressed on these animals. So
here in the United States, we also fund our animal shelters in the same way we do our school systems, for example, which is entirely out of local taxes. So a neighborhood that is lower income is also going to be producing a lower tax base. So their shelter is going to be lower resourced, which means that in general, the rate of killing overall in that shelter is going to be higher than, for example, another shelter that might just be 10 or 15 kilometers down the road, but is serving a more affluent, and in the United States, that generally also means a whiter population of people whose homes are producing higher property taxes and therefore more money for the shelter system, so it can be more innovative in implementing life-saving programs.
it's really important to point out those kind of structural dimensions, I think, because it's easy to kind of see a kill shelter and think, oh, bad, but they also exist, as you're saying here, within systems not necessarily of their choosing. I've heard of situations where you've got sanctuaries who are literally like bringing animals in. Their purpose is to give animals a good life and a place where they can live and die. But still, if you have an outbreak of influenza or you have some sort of pathogenic outbreak, they are subject to the same kind of laws and regulations that their state or their district is in. And they might have to kill their animals, or they might have to have their animals kinds of vaccinated or managed in a way that they wouldn't choose, right? So I think thinking about these larger structural dimensions is really important. And it is important when it comes to death as well. So I know one of the chapters in your book spoke about roadkill. And I think this for me was a really big kind of takeaway for the book. Is my introduction to thinking about animals and death was thinking about the numerous number of animals that are killed in our farming system, right? It's just the thousands and thousands of animals that are killed for food and for clothing, et cetera, et cetera. But your book highlights the kind of complexity with which you can think about animal death. You've got animals who are dying as a result of our infrastructure, like roads. You've got animals who are dying as in laboratories, fine, but also in forensics. That chapter on forensics was just, that it's being used to shape and inform so much research about how we understand human death and the ways in which humans die. And then, of course, you've got new industries that are centered around animal death emerging, whether it's on the guinea pig, for example. So just the complexity with which you were thinking about death was quite remarkable. And sorry for this big ramble, because I think something that really struck me was that there is no clear definition of death. You said that right early on. You've said several times here, Julian, it's not black and white. So then what is death? Is it just a matter of one of those things you know it when you see it?
Well, it's funny. One of my infamous TV appearances was on Fox, which is, for your international people, a very conservative news outlet. And it was about brain death, right? So even in neuroscience, when you go to a medical hospital, it's oftentimes a judgment call. Like, is this person alive? How alive are they? Or conversely, are they dead, or how dead are they? Right. So not just animals, but again, it's often a judgment call, which is very bizarre thing. Something so simple as death is that. I want to go back to
And I'll add, since we were
yeah.
reproduction, the same at the other end, right? When does life begin, right? When is somebody not dead but has come into being as a living being?
Yeah. So is it fertilized? Is it zygote? Right. So again, it's those things. I just want to comment on how admirable Katja is in terms of like clinical fatigue and going through that. Um, it's absolutely amazing, what she's been able to do and be a scholar about that. So I want to up my co-author, my co-editor on this and say it's pretty incredible what she was able to do and still be objective at the end of the day and produce a amazing piece of literature. So.
Well, that's nice. I think
It's really nice to hear on a Monday morning or
Oh, all right. After that lovely interlude, I wanted to. The subtitles of your book are about death and justifications and justice. So these kind of two key themes come up. So why don't we spend a little bit of time thinking about justifications for death? What justifies the death of animals?
Well, from an evolutionary biology perspective, if you went back 20,000 years ago, you wouldn't notice humans. It would sort of be like what you think of raccoons today. Like, yeah, you would see one every once in a while, and that would be about it. However, if you go back 10,000 years ago, humans are taking over the planet, right? And it's the beginning of what we call the Anthropocene, the human era, which is with us today. And a big part of that is our ability to domesticate not just plants, but domesticate animals. So on one hand, you got the killing of animals and the whole meat industry, which starts about 10,000 years ago when we move from hunter-gatherers to like domestication. You can really justify that you are here today. I am here today because our ancestors started the meat industry 10,000 years ago and started slaughtering animals on a regular basis. They're an amazing, amazing energy resource. You cannot get energy any other way than from animals. So the justification is certainly there in terms of us as a species. And having grown up on a farm, I grew up on a farm. My clinical fatigue led me to becoming a vegetarian and saying, okay, that was 10,000 years ago, but now we don't have to rely on that. So I think that there is clearly justification for it, but there are also alternatives to that as well, which you might say nullifies all of the justifications.
So, I mean, this comes down to that classic question of need versus want, right? So we justify killing animals because we say we need them. But as we was talking a moment ago, kind of structural differences and things change in circumstance. And at what point does that need become want or convenience? I mean, for me, I think this is a clear thing with regards to the scale of animal death, right? Obviously, the scale is very different now than it was 10,000 years ago. And the scale of animal death or animals who are slaughtered, I think, is also driven by convenience, the convenience and ease with which they are available, which certainly wasn't the case 10,000 years ago. So we justify their killing because we say we need it, and we justify their killing because we say we want it. What other justifications?
Yeah, I think that has given rise to a whole lot of socially complex justifications. We see, of course, a lot of religious justifications in the Western tradition, especially the Christian idea that humans stand above animals and that animals have, in fact, even been placed on the earth for humans' use. The idea that animals don't have souls, right? These are all ways of religious strategies of justifying the killing and consumption for different purposes, not just eating necessarily of animal bodies. in the industrial meat period that we also live in now. It's fascinating to see all of the different types of claims to justify meat consumption. There's been a trend here in the United States, I think primarily fueled over TikTok, emphasizing the essential need for men, especially, to consume high levels of meat for protein, right? So this whole sort of culture around steak eating and protein powders being added to your muscle shakes and so forth, that you can't, and in this way, meat eating has long been identified as heavily gendered, in that that men especially can demonstrate their masculinity by ripping into a rib, and standing outside at the barbecue and grilling animal flesh. So there's the claims that may have some origin in health, but they've also taken on justifications that are layered with social ideas about masculinity and femininity, also about social status. It's not my expertise, but it's my understanding that in China, for example, with its massively ballooning middle class, that meat consumption has just skyrocketed, because eating meat and particular forms of meat, namely pork and beef, is a way to demonstrate that you have, arrived, right? Reached a certain class status. And I think that has always existed, right, in Western cultures as well, right? Whether you have the filet mignon or the burger at McDonald's, right? Demonstrates something about your position, right? Your authority, your wealth, your influence in society as well. And so we can use those kinds of logics also to justify the continued killing of animals.
And so the consumption itself is also important here. And I mean, we've got, so these are kind of human justifications, I guess, for animal death. And you spoke also, Julian, about the kind of there's genetics involved. The desire to pass on genes is entangled with reproduction, but also with death. How else would animals, I think, justify? I mean, animals justify, I guess, I mean, this is like an impossible question. How do animals justify death or dying? And now we're really getting into philosophical realms, Schrodinger's cat here. But like, was there any kind of thought in your book with regards to how animals and animal cultures manage death of their own?
Yeah, they have no rules. Just I have chickens right now in my backyard, and their favorite thing to eat are their own eggs. So, and one of the cool things is about science is how it adapts to like new findings. When I was a beginning bio student, cannibalism was the exception, and now cannibalism has sort of become the rule throughout the animal kingdom, that we see a lot of that going on. So again, it's in biology, we talk all the time. In fact, one of our main concepts is energy, right? And just a great way to get energy is to take the energy that someone's already gotten for you. And that comes from, killing and consuming animals, And one of the things we should also think about with death, is particularly with humans, is, things like whale oil and religious, spiritual sort of thing, and, curing impotence and medicinal sort of things that go on with animals as well, and coats and warmth and hide, providing shelter. So it's not just consumption and the energy, but it's also other things that you can justify and more. That might have been the most long-winded answer ever to a question on a podcast. So my apologies.
No. Trust me, I've literally gone in rambles in asking questions that are longer than that, so you're fine. I think more what I was asking here was about animals' culture around death, and I think that I think there's a lot more going on here than just cannibalism. While that does exist, I mean, that also could be viewed as a kind of cultural artifact. And I know with chickens consuming eggs, this is also again tied to kind of deficiencies that they're trying to manage as well sometimes. But there is increasing kind of evidence and showcasing that animals have cultural practices around their own deaths. Things like elephants mourning their dead, going to specific places to die. These could be thought of as, death actions, preparations for death.
Yeah. Animal cultures around death is not something that we address head on, as far as I recall, in any of the chapters of when animals die. But I think it's a really interesting area of inquiry. And when you said cultures around death, you then went on to talk about cultures of grieving or mourning and remembrance. But what I immediately went to was thinking about how the actual act of killing has cultural components as well. If, for example, we think about culture as shared rituals that strengthen bonds between individual actors in a community, right, then sort of predatory behaviors of like group hunting, for example, could be interpreted as as a type of a cultural practice, because we now know, or we now believe that wolves, for example, and African painted dogs, and other canine species in particular, when they engage in hunting together, are increasing their group bonds, and also that there are specific roles that different members of the pack play in the hunting. That the predatory animals have modes of communicating with one another during the actual hunt, to provide cues about who is expected to do what, right, in a given moment. It's a deeply social behavior. And I think any human who has observed, lions hunting as a pride, or any kind of pack animal, right, hunting as a group, will observe that.
Yeah. I mean, I think a great example here are orcas, right? And I think there's quite a bit of evidence to show that orcas, while of the same species, have different cultural practices, in that different pods of orcas consume different foods, and they consume them sometimes exclusively differently. And they've developed different hunting techniques and practices, which is quite, I think you're right. They're also entangled in kind of death practices, whether that involves killing or consuming of the dead, and rituals and practices around dying itself.
Yeah, and orcas are also a great example of a species where we appear to observe pronounced mourning, right? It's here in the United States. I think it's been actually off the Canadian coast. There have been at least 2 instances I can think of in recent years of mother orcas who lost their young and continued to carry them around with them for weeks, right, following the death of the calf.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the start of the book that you're calling this kind of, I mean, when you start to talk about these big concepts, death, life, birth, you realize that it's not easy. And you mentioned at the start of the book that you're kind of dubbing this animal death studies. Now, I hadn't heard that before. Is this somewhat established, or is this an emerging field? Like, what is animal death studies? Because clearly there's a lot to talk about.
I would say it's not established. At least it's not an identity that I think scholars or others who might be engaged in it necessarily have. And yet it is a field in which people are working already. And I think part of our writing and naming animal death studies was to acknowledge people are doing this work, right? But we're not necessarily talking with each other about it, in part because of some of the disciplinary variations that Julian mentioned at the beginning of this conversation. Like, he's a biologist and neuroscientist, and I'm a feminist sociologist, right? In what universe in contemporary universities would we come into conversation with each other? Our disciplines are really siloed. But if we are able to conceptualize, both of us working in this field of animal death studies, that opens up a new space, or creates a space for interdisciplinary collaboration, right? It's not a disciplinary specific field.
I mean, I think this is one of the things that makes animal studies itself so interesting, is because it is inherently interdisciplinary. I mean, you could sit within your own silo, but if you really want to do justice to writing about or thinking about animals, if you're in the social sciences, you almost necessarily, I think, have to look at and learn from the natural sciences and biology and veterinary ethics, and ask these sorts of questions. But the same is also true on the other side. I think natural scientists have perhaps a lot of work to do with regards to learning from the relationships and the discussions that we've been having in the social sciences about questions of power and economics and why they are so important to thinking about animals' lives. And this brings us to the second part of your subtitle, which was on justice. What made you connect this? What's the connection between death and justice?
Well, the way the hard scientists did it is in that taphonomy chapter that you were talking about, right? Looking at the forensics. So we have a very hard line sort of thing. And I love that chapter. And it's a very cool chapter because it really looks at, one of the things you can do is, can you solve animal crimes? So, your neighbor kills your dog and you know that your neighbor did it. How do you prove that your neighbor did it? So a very cool, what we would say over here, CSI or Law and Order kind of forensic look at that. But I think that's one sort of chapter. I think Katja's sort of view on this is much wider, and I actually look forward to her answer on this.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Claudia. I think in approaching the work and thinking about animal death, I didn't, and I think this is true for you too, Julian. We didn't want us to stop with only examining justifications for death and knowledge and understanding of death, but also to think about what it would look like to live in a more just system of social organization for humans and for animals, where we might have a very different relationship, between humans and animals, that would increase opportunities for animals to have livable lives, right? Lives that are appropriate to their species, that offer them the resources and the stimulation and the care that is appropriate for their species, and that we would extend that also to all groups of humans. One thing that hasn't come up as much in our conversation so far is also thinking about the linkages between violence against animals and violence against certain types of humans, and how both historically and in the contemporary period, some groups of humans have been defined or constructed as being more animal-like than others, and how that's been used as a justification for displacement, for genocide. And what would it look like to move beyond that, right? If that is even possible. I hope it is possible, but to start teasing out some ways of thinking about more just systems of existence that would allow members of all species to thrive.
And what might some of those be?
Oh, well, I think that one of the core practices that we would need to move away from is, humans' deeply held belief in our right to control animal lives and our superiority to animals, that especially is used to justify practices like large-scale industrial farming, right? But also to move into worlds where, in general, we take animal concerns and how animals would want to live if we could understand them fully. I'm thinking about Matthew Calarco's chapter in the book on roadkill, which you mentioned, Claudia, earlier. And this was sort of a wake-up moment for me when I read this, that it had never occurred to me that roadkill, at least in the United States, but I suspect this is true probably in almost every part of the world, is the number 2 cause of death following farming for meat for animals. And if we were to include insects as as lives in that. I think it's probably number one, right? We just don't even value or consider animal lives. But I've also just finished reading a beautiful and interesting book on the construction of animal crossings and the increased movement to rethink humans' right to roadways and to transportation, right? And to consider instead what animals need in order for them to not be run over by trains and vehicles and so forth. And it may seem like a relatively small step, but if we were actually to, very proactively develop strategies globally for animals to be able to pass over roadways or train tracks, we could really significantly reduce mortality among free roaming animals and spare them a type of death that I think is probably also particularly, unpleasant and can occur at any moment of the life course. So even very young animals are being killed.
Yeah, I think it's no small thing at all. There's a fantastic book called Killer Cities that speaks not only about roads, but just infrastructure in general. Animals are displaced. And in that book, my mind was kind of blown with thinking about under the ground, because he speaks, it's Nigel Thrift, and he speaks about how, building underground, you're also displacing a lot of soil, a lot of animals, and a lot of death happens in the kind of building and the constructing of our societies. And I think, to add to your question of justice, I think slowing down is probably a key thing. This kind of productive churn of just having more and needing to be productive. You speak about capitalism a lot in the book, and I think it features prominently in several of the chapters.
And it's about bringing animals back into conversations, like to your point about the construction of cities, for example. There's been a lot of hoopla, at least here in the Los Angeles area, about a community that's being built in Phoenix, Arizona, that is going to be America's first purposely built car-free community. So there's no parking anywhere inside of it. There's some places at its peripheries where delivery trucks, could pause and drop things off. But it's meant to be some place that's entirely for pedestrians and will have no cars. So there's been a lot of writing about it in the American Southwest, and is this the future of American, community planning to live in car-free, communities that then are connected to each other via rail or some other mechanism? But there's literally nothing I have seen about this community has there been any conversation about animals. And look at pictures of it. It's sort of townhouse style buildings. It actually looks to me a lot like sort of old European cities, like small alleyways with, tight buildings, which is fine and good. But I'm wondering how are animal beings part of this landscape? I know from personal experience that Phoenix is a place where you encounter among mammals, coyotes, javelinas, desert hares, of course, insects, lizards, spiders. Where and how are all these beings even part of the planning process? Right? They're simply not there. Right? And so whole strand of talking about, animal democracy, right, and bringing animals into our political processes. And I think that's a big part of justice as well.
100%. And I think this lack of inclusion in our future visions will contribute to further death in future, because you'll end up with political situations where you might have a coyote in a neighborhood that you didn't want, but you had everything you constructed was pulling them in, was saying, hey, this is a great place for me to be. And it's one of my key critiques of kind of greening strategies. We like to talk about greening cities and creating, but this will also attract other animals. And I'm happy to have other animals here, but not everyone has my outlook. So we need to realize what policies and practices are there to protect animals that your new green cities are going to attract. Without that lack of, I think, political vision, you end up creating circumstances for future death. Because far too often, I think when animals become a nuisance or an inconvenience in these situations, death is the answer to how to control them, as you said earlier. Do you have any other further thoughts, Julian, on the question of like justice and death?
Sure. I mean, well, first of all, on that note, I mean, in New Jersey, we have bear hunts. And, as horrible as that sounds, right? No one wants a bear, in their backyard, it's so managing those things and the death of, animals is an issue. Yeah. I remember like 30 years ago, I was asked to join a primate human rights group that sole purpose was to advocate that they could vote. So, how we handle these issues, right? And if we go too far in one extreme is something we obviously have to think about, but maybe that's too esoteric. In our institution, and almost every institution, and I believe the federal government defines it this way, we have an IACOG, which is basically a research board that says, if you're going to do research on animals, you have to meet certain standards. But that ends at vertebrates. So if you're doing invertebrate animals, you can do anything that you want. So the fact that you guys brought up insects is a really important distinction here, because we really don't value the lives of insects. And so insect death, and you were talking about this, before we got on the podcast about ants, right? That insect death has taken a backseat to other higher animals, and higher animals basically means vertebrates. So I think that it's an interesting thing that we think about how we classify animals, and I'll stop on this. One of the things about dogs is really there weren't separate breeds till about 400 years ago. That the breeding of dogs, you were a dog up till about 400 years ago, and now we've started to classify dogs, and it is a little interesting that. Again, it's the thing I loved about Katja, and it was the real attraction to work with her, is how the classification of dogs also mimics the classifications of how we value death. That certain deaths just don't mean a lot to us, whereas other deaths are just horrific and horrible, and it depends on how we've classified them. So,
yeah. I mean, there's been an explosion of research now and consideration with regards to thinking about the lives and the deaths, I think, of insects, and kind of questions of consciousness and what do we know with regards to how they experience pain or pleasure. I think Jeff Sebo is doing quite a bit there. But, I think part of our culture is that we do, in general, tend to value whatever we conceive as being closer to us. And I think you've got these exceptions like octopuses, octopi, that are quite different to us in almost every single way. Like we've diverged from the evolutionary tree from one another a long time ago. But they are hyper intelligent, ingenious, and they've captured people's imaginations in a way that perhaps insects don't. And now, of course,
if I can interrupt you, Claudia, they're invertebrates, so
yeah,
they would go under the class of insect. All the cephalopods. We would not have to get research permission to work on them. Sorry for interrupting, but
no, not at all.
You bring up an interesting point.
It's a and I think that they are one of the ones that have captured people's imagination and have actually gotten people to mobilize around getting more rights for more animals with regards to questions and ethics related to research. And I know the current proposal that octopus farming is taking off now and becoming legal in European and I think in the US as well. That this has got hello, I've got a doggy friend saying hi. This has gotten a lot of he's so gorgeous.
Sorry, she's come back from her morning run with her other guardian, so she's feeling ebullient. But I will tell you, I don't know if you even have this animal where you live, Claudia, but she encountered a skunk a few nights ago.
Oh, and did she get a spray?
Oh, she got so sprayed. So she's few skunk-specific baths, but she's still, when she comes up and kisses me, I'm like, okay, it's a lot.
At least it wasn't a porcupine.
Yeah,
that would have hurt. All right, and I mean, you bring up such an interesting now my brain is like doing a dance, because I think what we were talking about with regards to like the ethics of how animals are researched on and also how they're killed. Like we use all these euphemisms for killing them in order to do research. And it must be said that a lot of research that's done on these animals is also often not necessary. It's done to kind of get a PhD project or something finished where we know the answer already. And I know a lot of scientists will disagree with me on that, but I don't know. Julian, is that unfair to say?
No, it's definitely not unfair to say. And like one of the things that I have a colleague, Steven Pinker, and he wrote this book about how the world is getting less and less violent, which is absolutely true as long as you ignore World War II. Like the world is never. And one of the things that he brings up is the rise of vegetarianism, the rise of PETA, and the rise of actual animal ethics. When I was an undergrad and we took experimental psych, everyone got a rat. And what you would do with that rat depended on what group you're in, and you would do some sort of psychosurgery where you would implant electrodes. And in one of the groups, the animal would hit a bar, and I'm making nonverbal. That's not very helpful on a podcast. The rat would hit a bar, and it would keep pressing the bar because what was happening in the brain is that dopamine was being released, and it felt really good. And the rat would hit the bar to the point of death. They would actually kill themselves, and we would then note that in our notebooks and say, "Oh, isn't that interesting that the pleasure-seeking killed the rat?" So we don't do that anymore. So and I hate to leave on a hopeful note, but there are some hopeful trends in animals that we do see the rise of vegetarianism. We do see the rise of animal research. So, for example, at the institution I am right now, animal research has become, this is vertebrate animal research, I'm pointing out, those that are ethically guided has become so costly because of the care that you need to take for animals that most people don't do it, which is a very good thing, right? Because you need to have a vet, you need to have the right facilities, etc. So our animal facility is basically empty at this point, which is good, because exactly what you're saying, because a lot of the animal research we've identified as being redundant or unnecessary, or really treats the animals poorly to the point where it's unsustainable. So yes, I agree with your premise that a lot of it is bad, but I also want to point out the good things that have happened. That I know regulation's not a big thing in America these days, but that regulation, the number of lives that it has saved in terms of at least vertebrates, has been spectacular. So yes, I agree that we could do a whole lot more, but I do want to acknowledge that at least something has been done.
That's important to note. And I know that other technologies, there's some. I had Thomas Harting on the show, and he spoke about how, for him, sometimes this is almost like slow science. The fact that in some ways animal subjects are still being used as models to understand human health is strange when you've kind of got this onset of artificial intelligence and organoids and human, my mind was completely and utterly blown speaking to him. Like he was talking about how organs are being grown. I was like, whoa, this is like sci-fi stuff from when I was a kid. I can't believe these things are happening now. So, okay, before I ask you for the quote, perhaps we've jumped around a little bit with regards to the book. We've touched on several themes that came up with the book, things like killing, consumption, capitalism, as well as, various justifications, but also why this is a question of justice. And I think arguably maybe something we haven't said is that we would like to see less animal death, right? This is a question of justice because there's too much death. And we've kind of mentioned, I think, several really interesting chapters. We spoke a little bit about community cats. We've spoken about Matthew Kalako's question of roadkill. We mentioned your, Julian, chapter on, thinking about human and animal conceptions of death. There are several others that we mentioned, but I don't think we've spoken yet about the whale hunt, kind of questions of how indigenous knowledges shape and think about death through questions of reciprocity. We did speak about Christianity, but not perhaps how indigenous knowledges talk about that. I briefly mentioned the guinea pig chapter, which I think was really interesting. The guinea pig chapter, just like the emergence of a new meat industry / international cuisine around the consumption of guinea pigs. Are there any other chapters that you want to highlight or just dive into a little bit before we start wrapping things up?
what stands out to me across a number of the chapters is a theme around technology and if and how it is used to improve or denigrate the quality of life that animals experience. I'm thinking about Carrie Ducote's contribution on the governance of avian influenza in the United States. And that, of course, has such an ongoingly timely topic, right? It's like avian influenza is here to stay. Her presentation and description of the practice around culling or the mass killing of birds who are even suspected of being exposed to avian influenza. So you don't even have to, be definitively sickened by this illness, but who, have been identified as high risk. It's the least technologically advanced approach, right? Literally letting the birds suffocate to death. And then at the same time, work that is being done, like in the chapter by Lisa Jean Moore to create transgenic animals, right?
Oh, the spider goats.
Yeah, the spider goats, and what is possible when capitalism can benefit, directly from the creation and then ultimately what appears to be the path to extinction again, right, of the spider goat.
I mean, what I loved about that chapter, though, is exactly what you say, is it highlighted the kind of entanglement of reproduction and death. Like they literally brought a new type of being into existence for the purpose of some sort of product, the silk. And it was interesting and they were being monitored and a year-long project, but now no longer feasible. There's another animal that can make the silk more efficiently. So now these goats just don't have their use value anymore, to straight up bring up some Marxian terms. They're not useful anymore, so we'll just let them go. And it's this question of, is there something lost now in them disappearing and being removed? It's a brilliant chapter, really interesting.
So the avian flu, we're speaking now in April of 2025. Egg prices in the United States have gone off the charts because we've had to kill all our animals. I mean, all of our chickens because of, another outbreak in avian flu. So, my chickens in the backyard are safe, are luckily safe because they're not part of this huge monoculture that's, come out of the egg industry. And, so that chapter is certainly pertinent, even, a year after this book has been published. And then, had Lisa Jean, that chapter is so fun. The spider goat chapter, that I didn't think I would ever say that a chapter was fun on animal death. But if the readers pick up this book and they read that, it's an actual enjoyable, fun, and exciting chapter to read. And Lisa Jean Moore should be thanked for writing such a entertaining but informative and important chapter.
What you said there about the avian influenza also just made me think briefly here about the mobility of death, because I think avian influenza kind of shows how death and disease move as well. So it's not just farmed birds that are being impacted by avian influenza, right? It's now being picked up by wildfowl who are then spreading it to other farms and amongst other, and you're kind of getting the same way pandemics move amongst human populations, diseases, and same thing with swine flu, African swine flu or fever. I mean, it's causing incredible numbers of death, and the fact that this death is included in the capitalist calculation of these industries is really quite remarkable. Anyway, thank you both of you for this work, for a really fascinating discussion on death. I don't think we reached any conclusions. There was no finality to our conversation, but I think that's perfectly fine. Do you have a quote ready for us?
I do. I'm just pulling open my book. So my quote was actually questions.
So no finality at all.
No, there's no finality in the quote that I selected, which is from the introduction to the book that Julie and I wrote as we were thinking about the immense complexity of animal death and all of the different arenas in which it occurs, the wide range of justifications. I mean, on that topic alone, we could write an encyclopedia, right? It doesn't need to be a slimmer anthology like this one. But I think that this quote presents some important questions, and also turns again to this idea that we need to develop and keep talking as a field about animal death studies and bring people together into interdisciplinary conversation. So this is from page 8 of When Animals Die. How can we make sense of so many living things being subjected to violence and killed? Can we make sense of it? What can we know about the way other than human animals experience death? Where can we see the interconnectedness of human and animal lives and deaths? And perhaps most urgently, what can we do to stop the horrific rates of animicide and speciescide? Rather than turning away from these questions, animal death studies and the contributions to this volume move toward them.
Yeah, that's a great quote to sum up, the book and what we've been talking about here today. You mentioned the animicide and specieside. I can never say anything with the word species in it. Could you just give us a quick definition of those? Because I think they're really important and powerful concepts.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk in the book about specieside as referring to the killing of to the killing of members of a species with the goal or outcome of species annihilation. So it doesn't have to be that it's intended that the species is going to, say, become extinct, but that is the ultimate outcome of specieside, is that a species no longer exists.
Is that within a specific geography, or let's say in New Zealand, they're trying to get rid of toads, and they actively are killing and eradicating toads? Would that be a form of specieside?
Would be. Yes.
So just the act of even though they're not successful in achieving extinction or eradication, this is an act of specieside.
Yes. So this is now going to become a pronunciation challenge for me, but I would say that the eradication in many places to try to rid an ecosystem of so-called invasive species are speciecidal campaigns.
Okay.
Right. So
powerful.
Right. It's not complete, but it's underway. Right. Just as we might refer to campaigns attempting to annihilate a population of people as genocide, but before it's complete.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it sounds horrible until your kid has died of malaria. I'm all for mosquitoes till something like that happens, right? So, weighing specieside, which sounds on the outset horrible, but then you realize the number of deaths that are caused by mosquitoes starts to take you on another, and it's not just death, it's misery, from Zika to malaria, that as a human, you start to think, well, maybe having mosquitoes isn't the greatest thing on this planet. And, if other animals have gone extinct, would the world be so bad without mosquitoes? And that's one of the things that we have to weigh when we think about animal death. Like, are there justifiable times where you can actually get rid of a species?
I think your logic, a lot of people probably agree with you, but the challenge is when you kind of think about one species, at a time, when you start to count up the number of species that we apply that kind of logic to, it just racks up and it counts up. And I think, Krithika Srinivasan, and, she speaks, and I think Matthew Kalaka also spoke about this, the logic of sacrifice, this idea that how do we distribute the risk of a society and who burdens most of these risks? And I think, again, this speaks to kind of the interconnections of different human populations and different animal populations. Who in our societies has to bear the most of society's burdens, and who has to bear most of the benefits? But I take your point, Julian. It's not as simple as just saying, this is bad. But I would also caution on the other side, it's not as easy as just saying that's the solution, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Listen, I'm as liberal as they come, and making claims that it might be, in everybody's interest other than the species itself to get rid of that species is a difficult thing to say. But if we acknowledge that we have that capability and that we can ease suffering, then, it does become something that is, that we have to think about scientifically, like, is keeping a certain species around a good thing to do or a bad thing to do?
Well, it's the example of the toads as well. I mean, I think those toads exist in other ecosystems that you were mentioning in New Zealand, but right, that is also, in how to handle invasive species has been a contentious a topic, right, about those rights, so-called invasive species to exist in the ecosystem to which humans overwhelmingly transported them.
And clearly we're making choices there. An invasive species that we have here in America is, the Italian honeybee, which is awesome. Everyone loves the honeybee, and it, is
And
pollen.
cows and pigs and horses.
Exactly. Those are all invasive species. But then when you start talking about, jellyfish, people start to say, wait a minute, do we really need jellyfish around?
Mm.
They're, what good are the jellyfish?
And sometimes our tendency to intervene, we're very quick to intervene. And part of the reason toads are in New Zealand and Australia is because they were introduced to as an agricultural response to another animal. So I think it's this kind of constant. So coming back to the mosquitoes, my question ends up being, well, what are the ripple effects of removing
Oh,
mosquitoes from certain
absolutely.
environments, right? They're also key pollinators. They're key food sources for numerous other species. So it's not just a matter of thinking about humans' interests. There are other ways to think about malaria and the spread of things like malaria, and also it's not tick-bite fever. It's tick-bite fever in South Africa, but it's when you get bitten by a tick, you end up with
Lyme disease?
Lyme
Lyme disease?
disease. Lyme disease is spreading more and more as the climate is changing, etc. And these are really important and significant. And I think, one, we have to ask ourselves, have we ever really been successful at eradicating an animal or a species from a specific location? I don't think we had. There are some isolated cases, but in general, they've proven fruitless. So, I mean, I take your point, but I think there are knock-on effects to our interventions, right, that could lead to other unforeseen circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the bats would be very upset if we got rid of the mosquitoes. That is for sure. We would have a, I'd never win that contingent of my electorate.
No.
I'd never have
I mean, think
bats
about
voting for me.
krill. Krill in the ocean, people are probably like, oh, it's just these
Right.
tiny little, like, who cares about krill? But the decimation of krill is like destroying, or one of the reasons that are destroying the ocean, because they're these tiny, seemingly insignificant creatures, but actually they are really significant and important. It's, more work to do, to understand, to make informed decisions, I think is what we're all saying here, is not quick decisions.
Yeah.
So sorry, Katja.
So
that's specieside.
Yes. I was going to say, let's not forget about animicide before we...
Animicide.
So I think animicide more broadly, so it's not specific to a species, but refers to any kind of organized campaign or effort on the part of people, of humans, to kill animals for human gain, of some form. So we could think of like factory farming as a whole as a type of animicide, right? It is involving the large scale killing of animals, chickens, pigs, cows, other types of animals by location as well, is a type of animicide where the end result isn't the extinction of a species. Right. But the end result is the ongoing killing of these animals with the consequence of humans profiting in some way.
So does the intention need to be to kill animals, or could something, I mean, deforestation happens intentionally, right? Like you think about palm oil deforestation and its impacts on animals in Indonesia. Would that be considered then a form of animicide? I think that's intentional, but could you imagine unintentional animicide? So runaway fires that are caused because of human activities.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah, and
they're not
I would
intentionally killing
definitely
animals.
include foresting, deforestation, logging, etc. I would include that as a type of animicide, and in some cases, since you mentioned Indonesia, speciescide, right? Like orangutans are being functionally rendered extinct specifically because of the incursions into their land from palm oil plantations.
But the intention with forestry is not to hurt animals. So the intention with factory farms is to kill animals, right? Kill animals to make profit. But the intention with logging is to get wood to make profits. The direct intention is not to kill animals, but that would still be a form of animicide just because of the numbers of animal deaths that result. Okay, I'm with you.
Yeah, I think I would consider it as such, and there probably are others who might split hairs with me about that, and I totally would acknowledge that as well. The degree of intent, and so when you mentioned, for example, like wildfires, which I've just experienced here in Los Angeles, and where so far there's been literally no media reporting about what the estimated number of casualties has been of so-called wild or free-roaming animals, that, might get more into murkier territory about intent, right? We've obviously failed to intervene in climate change processes that would reduce the risk of wildfire. But we also know in California that wildfire has been part of this landscape for seemingly as long as the landscape has existed. Human activity is accelerating that, and especially is accelerating the way the fires move and the intensity of the fires, which presumably gives animals fewer opportunities to escape. But I think there probably we wouldn't be talking about that so much as animicide.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, just the lack of reporting there brought to mind a kind of key distinction you made also in the book is there's physical death, but there's also social death. There's a kind of, the social invisibility of animals here. But yeah, I think, I don't know if we have time to necessarily pry those apart here, but it is important to note that you can have social death. You can be disregarded socially, which is perhaps a form of dying. Julian, do you have your quote ready for us?
Sure. My quote is very similar. It's Paola Prada Tiedemann, page 178, and she's talking about forensics. But she goes on to say, this issue raises the question, is the death of an animal ever justified to perform observations that will not directly help anyone in the immediate future? In other words, as we take on a godlike role, which we've sort of had for the last 10,000 years, right? How do we weigh our own existence versus the ability to have control over other animals and animal death? And I think that is one of the things that I love about working with Katja and people like you, Claudia, is like spurring, like, okay, where are we drawing the line? Is it ever okay to kill another animal? Or do we go full Buddhist and say it's never okay to take the life of any other organism, be it any other animal? And how do we actually, live on an earth with 8 billion people and actually, try to have some sort of meaningful discussion about what is okay and what is not okay. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think the idea of drawing lines, often the social sciences, we're not too fond of lines and boundaries. I think we like to transgress
No, we're
boundaries.
not.
But that said, I think from a justice perspective, lines are pretty important. Figuring out where those lines are is it's not easy, and there's going to be disagreements. But I think that is an important part of the project: is where do we draw our lines, and what do we expect of our different societies? And yeah, I think that's a really important point. All right, folks. Thank you so much for your time and for indulging me with understanding all of these different concepts and ideas. Before we close, perhaps you could tell the listeners a little bit about what you're currently working on, and if they want to get in touch with you about some of your work, how they can do so. Julian, why don't we start with you, and then we'll end with Katja.
Sure. My next book is coming out with Cambridge University Press, and it's on how to do neuroscience at an economically challenged and institution. So it's a very different book. But I'm also working on a project that involves the potato. And like animals, the potato has been very coveted because of its energy richness. So the potato has been exploited to the point of what we've seen with animals backfiring, right? So we've seen amazing famines caused by the monoculture of the potato, the most famous being the Great Hunger in Ireland. And just like the meat industry coming back and causing death and disease and exploitation, et cetera, that we see in the meat industry, the potato is also in a very similar position. It's coveted, but it's also come back to hurt us in a lot of ways. So if you're interested in contacting me, I'm at Montclair State University in beautiful New Jersey, United States. And we accept donations to further research. We are a minority. So we are a minority-dominated university. So anyone who wants to send money our way, feel free.
Thank you so much for having us, Claudia. I am currently working on 2 projects. One of the projects focuses on intersections of power and inequality and placemaking in the context of human relationships with 2 different groups here of cats, 2 groups of cats here in the Los Angeles area. One of them, pumas, also known here locally, we call them mountain lions most of the time, and community cats, or so-called feral cats. And I'm really working to bring together ideas from feminist animal studies and queer ecologies and urban ethnography, and also disability studies, to look at how different human-created structures of inequality are shaping the human-animal entanglements with those 2 types of cats, the pumas and the feral cats, and in turn, how those entanglements help define the place of the city of Los Angeles. And by place, I'm referring to like the sense of identity or belonging or character that humans ascribe to geographically bounded areas. And I'm really particularly honing in on how pumas today are now recognized as native or indigenous residents that demand conservation support, whereas in the past they had been viewed as pest animals who were retarding sort of the progress of Western conquest by white settlers, where inversely the community cats who were brought to the United States by those same white settlers now are being viewed as pest animals who need to be managed or annihilated. So that's one project. The other one is a different kind of project. It's more of a manifesto and a scholarly examination. Working title is simply Against Animal Shelters. And it is a book detailing and arguing why the sheltering model of caring for unhoused companion animals doesn't work, and that trying to reform animal shelters, both in the United States and other countries, is really a form of magical thinking, and that we need to do away with animal shelters altogether as institutions and embrace some other more radical ways of reimagining human care for animals who are temporarily unhoused.
I love it, guys.
I want to buy that book.
From neuroscience to potatoes to thinking about animal shelters and placemaking. it all sounds really interesting. I want to buy both of them. I want to buy all three. I need to learn a bit more neuroscience. So how does my brain work? Like you said at the beginning, I think we know more about stars and the galaxies than our own brains, which is, I mean, no, you didn't say that. I just said that. But we know more about stars and the galaxies than we do our own brains, which I think is pretty remarkable.
Right. And I should add that I'm a faculty member at the University of California in Riverside. Yeah, I'm happy to hear from folks. My email address is just my first name, which is spelled Katja @ucr.edu.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both of you for joining me on the show and for being so generous with your time and thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katja and Julian, for being wonderful guests today. To Jeremy John for the logo and Gordon Clark for the bed music. Thank you also to Animals in Philosophy, Politics, and Law and Ethics, A.P.P.L.E, for sponsoring the show. This episode was hosted, edited, and produced by myself. This is The Animal Turn with me, Claudia Hurtenfelder.
This is another iRaw podcast.